thank you so much for coming to see this show. Now, this show is a story. And I love stories. I love listening to stories. I love telling stories. And I think it's because I prefer stories to real life. And I'll give you a perfect example of why. I was in a cafe recently and I was reading the Daily Mail. Yeah, don't look at me like that. It was the only paper left in the cafe. All right? And you know when you're reading the Daily Mail in public, you have to pull that face that shows people that you don't agree with it. You know. And I got to this story. There was this story sort of halfway through the paper. And it was a story about this woman. And she had been diagnosed with cancer. And the surgeon said to her, look, there's really no point in you pursuing therapy because the cancer had metastasized. It had spread all through her body. But she made this really brave decision. She decided to pursue treatment. And she was incredibly sick. I mean, over the course of 3 years, she did chemo and radio. And she nearly died many times. And when she was at her absolute sickest, she put together a bucket list. And at number one, very top of her bucket list, was that she wanted to ride a horse bareback along a deserted beach. And then a miracle happened. She got better. She completely defied the surgeon's expectations. I mean, this was a medical anomaly. So she did it. She went to this beach, she got a horse, she rode it bareback along the beach. Halfway down the beach, she fell off, smashed her fifth vertebrae, died instantly. I know. I mean, it's just one of those stories that just makes you go, oh, come on! What? I mean, because it was the Daily Mail, the bulk of the article was about the Romanian who had sold her the horse. It's a horrible, sad story. And it elicits so many emotions, doesn't it? You're like, but that's so unreasonable. But that's so unfair. But that's so cruel. And then the biggest question, why did that happen? And that's why I prefer stories to real life, because in a story, everything happens for a reason. In a story, everything happens because it's meant to. Best of all, when you tell a story, you can fix what you couldn't fix in real life. You get to play God. And this show is a story about a day in October in 1990 when I saw a miracle happen to a boy, and his name was George Peach. And the story's set in the town that I grew up in. I grew up in Australia, in a town called Newcastle, and it was rough. I mean, all the mines were shutting down, and I mean, I don't want to boast this early in the show, guys, but in 1987 we were actually the young offenders capital of Australia. Thank you. It was a rough town, and I went to the local high school, and of course it was a very rough high school, and everybody hated George Peach. George Peach, he was just one of those kids. I mean, he was a lightning rod for trouble. I mean, for a start, he looked like a peach. I mean, he was soft and round like a peach. He bruised like a peach. And he would cop it from the morning he started at that school. He walked in on that first day, you know, the jocks and the skaters, they all tripped him over and they threw his backpack up on the roof. And the biggest bully of them all was this kid called Simon Drake. And Simon Drake was 2 years older than us, and he was a skateboarder. And he was pathologically cruel to George Peach. I mean, it was physical, what he did to him. He'd do things like dump him in a garbage bin bottom first, so George couldn't get out of the garbage bin. It was like flipping a turtle onto its back. And when it was George Peach's birthday, Simon Drake screamed out across the playground, "Hey, mate, we got you a cake!" And he pinned George Peach. He knelt on his chest and he force-fed him a urinal cake. He was a horrible, horrible kid. And I just think that if any of us had known what was going to happen to George Peach in October of 1990, I think we would have been nicer to him. I do. I mean, I would have been nicer to him. But there was nothing I could do to help George Peach. I mean, I was drowning too. You know, I didn't have a boyfriend. I didn't have any friends. I never went to wild parties. I was completely invisible. And this one afternoon, we were on the bus, and Simon Drake had George Peach's backpack. And he was taking items out of the backpack, and he was going over to the window and throwing these items out the window. And everybody was laughing, and George Peach was begging him to stop. And then Simon Drake took out George Peach's lunchbox, his Fresh Prince of Bel-Air lunchbox. And for a moment, Simon Drake nearly lost the crowd. Everybody was looking at that lunchbox, and they were thinking the same thing. That is a beautiful lunchbox. And George Peach just screamed, "No, please don't, that was a birthday present!" And Simon Drake just laughed. And he went over to the window and he threw it out into traffic. And it got run over by a couple of cars, and eventually it wound up in the gutter. The lunchbox's life just like the Fresh Prince's, flip turned upside down. And when everybody was off the bus that afternoon, I saw something that I had never seen before. George Peach started to cry. He physically crumpled. It was like this was just one event too far. You know, and I looked around and I thought, well, there's no one else on the bus. No one's going to see me talking to him. And I sat down next to George and I said, are you okay? And he didn't answer me. And I said, George, can I give you some advice? And George said, sure. And I said, George, you have to stop what you're doing. And George said, but I'm just being myself. And I said, exactly, George. You have to stop that. And I took George Peach under my wing. I taught him everything that I had learned about disappearing, about falling off the radar. I gave him valuable life skills. I mean, skills like giving up, backing down, not being true to yourself. I was like a demotivational guru. And George Peach and I, we became friends. When no one else was around on the bus and it was just the two of us, we would talk. He was like my secret friend. And we started to trust each other. You know, I remember this one afternoon, we were sitting on the bus and his shirt collar was torn, his lip was cut. And I said to George, did Simon Drake do that to you? And he didn't really answer me. He just stared out the window and he said to me, do you know the only thing that keeps me going is knowing that one day I'm going to get out of this shithole. And when I do, I am never coming back. And George said, I'm going to be a magician. George could do magic tricks. And he was really, really good at them. He'd borrowed this book from the school library, and it was called Magic, Illusions, and the Power of Suggestion. And he'd learned all of them. You know, he'd start every trick by going, would you like to see a magic trick? And he could do all these fantastic tricks, like he could bend coins, he could do card tricks. But the real jewel in the crown, like the best trick that he did, was that he would get an item like a pebble or a coin and put it in my fist. And he'd say, all right, now close your hand around it. Now close your eyes and count to 3. And it moved to the other fist. I mean, it was amazing. You know, I said to him, George Peach, you're incredible. And he sort of smiled and he said, you and I should sit together at lunch. And I was like, no, George, come on. And he was like, why not? And I said, George, look, I want you to think of our school. It's like an ocean, all right? And it is infested with sharks. Now, in that ocean, I am a surfer. And my legs are sort of dangling over the side of my surfboard. But you, George, you're like a fat seal with its period. And I know that is a very harsh aquatic simile, I know. But I had to look out for myself. I looked out for myself. And in October of 1990, we went away on a school camp to a place called Camp Yondeo. And what happened at Camp Yondeo, it affected George Peach for the rest of his life. Now, Camp Yondeo was a beach camp. So you had this huge sprawling beach, and then there was the beach camp, and then there was this huge forest with a lake. So on the first night, we were in our tent. We were in our same-sex tent. And the talk turned to boys. Of course it turned to boys. Now, one of the girls in that tent had a boyfriend, and her name was Gretchen Buttsworth. She actually had a boyfriend. They had met when they came equal first in a regional maths competition. Yeah, so she was telling us all about that. I was lying there in the dark. And then out of nowhere, Gretchen Buttsworth just goes, so Sarah, is there anyone you're interested in? I knew I was being set up. I just knew. Teenagers know. You know, I could hear people smiling in the dark. She said, because I hear when no one else is around on the bus, you and George Peach get pretty cosy. And I said, I don't know what you're laughing about, all right? I hate George Peach. I wish he was dead. I know, it was like the worst thing I could have said. And the next day, it was the hottest day in October on record. We went on a 3-hour-long bushwalk, right? And it was hosted by Miss Perkins, our alcoholic school librarian. Now, Miss Perkins was terribly hungover on the day of this bushwalk, and we all knew it, because you know the way the light sort of dapples on the forest floor? Every time Miss Perkins would accidentally walk into a small pool of light, she'd make this noise, like this sort of noise, and she'd duck behind a tree and drink from her coffee thermos. The coffee thermos she took with her everywhere. And our destination was this rock pool. It was a man-made rock pool, and it had been built into a rock shelf back in the 1920s. It was very deep, it was tidal, so waves were always crashing over the side. And up the cliff face, there was a ledge that sort of jut out over the pool. So, of course, kids would climb up the cliff face and they would jump off the ledge into the pool. But the thing is, there were all these boulders at the base of the cliff. So you had to jump hard to make sure that you landed in the pool. Those were the safety instructions. So everybody's queuing to climb up and jump off this ledge. Not me, I was in the shade. It's where you will find the majority of redheads in Australia. If you ever lose a redhead in Australia, just check the shade. We're all there. We're literally all of us. And George Peach came over to talk to me, and I had told him not to talk to me in public. And he was wearing Speedos, for God's sake. Speedos! Everybody else was in board shorts, not George. And George said, "Hey, can I borrow $1?" I said, "George, go away. Gretchen Buttsworth's telling everybody that we're going out." And he persisted. He said, "Can I borrow $1? Because, I don't know, I thought I might go and buy a wagon wheel." And I said, "George, would you piss off?" And maybe if I had just spoken to him that day, things would have been different. Or maybe if I'd given him $1, everything could have turned out differently. But that's not what I did. And 15 minutes later, I looked up, and George Peach was at the front of the queue to jump off the ledge. And I saw him up there. I was like, what is he doing? I mean, it was so high up. And George Peach sort of stepped forward and looked over, and he leapt back. He was frozen in terror, absolutely petrified. And people in the queue started agitating. They're like, "Come on, George!" And I swear he looked at me. And he stepped forward, and he lost his footing. And he slipped. And he did not clear the boulders at the base of the cliff. He hit them first on his side. And then from there, he sort of bounced and caught the biggest boulder with his face. And from there, he slid into the water and he disappeared. And it was chaos. I mean, it was total chaos. 120 kids all jumped into the water. Everybody was trying to find George Peach. And all the teachers were like, "Everybody get out of the water!" Because kids were coming up to the surface with some kid who wasn't George Peach. And then they located George Peach. He was on the bottom of the pool. They found him, but they couldn't bring him up to the surface. And later, we found out that the toggle on his Speedos was snagged. But when they pulled him free, his Speedos, they came clean off. He was totally naked. And they lay his body next to the pool. And that's how 120 students and 6 teachers came to be standing around George Peach's dead body in October of 1990. And then a miracle happened. Miss Perkins, the alcoholic librarian, pushed her way to the front of the crowd. Now, if you are ever in a crisis, always turn to the drunkest person in the room. Drunk people don't lose their head in a crisis the way sober people do. And she pushed her way through and she knelt down and she listened for breathing and she said, "Nothing." And she started doing chest compressions. And we all just stood there silently, just watching her fight for George Peach's life. And the chest compressions were getting more violent. And she said, "Oh, come on." And then everybody started chanting it. Everybody was like, "Come on, George Peach. Come on, George Peach." And she blew into his mouth. She was still getting nothing. You could tell she was starting to panic. She blew into his mouth a second time and then a third time. And that was the moment that George Peach was ripped back into this life. And he threw up directly into Miss Perkins' mouth. Now, you can't do that to a hungover lady without there being consequences. George's vomit hit her epiglottis and she just instantly, blah, straight back into George's mouth. George Peach had been dead for exactly 11 seconds. And I don't know what this says about me as a person, but I had spent the bulk of those 11 seconds thinking, do I cover up his penis and balls? I just think if I was dead and everybody could see my vagina, I would hope somebody would cover it up. A dead vagina needs covering just as much as a live vagina, which was the original title of this show. But Miss Perkins had done it. This inebriated bookworm had done it. Her whiskey-flavoured kiss of life had brought George back. And George sat up, and he threw up for a second time. all over his penis and balls. You know, and he must have got that dollar from someone, because there was wagon wheel all through. It was like the worst advertisement for wagon wheel. And everybody was doing something different, you know. I mean, some people were crying, people were hugging, the teachers were drinking from the coffee thermos. And in the middle of it all, George just sat there, just naked and slippery, like a newborn, just blinking. And everybody was so distracted, you know. I sort of slid in next to George and I said to him, "Oh my God, George Peach, you scared the shit out of me." And then someone went, "Hey, Sarah, your boyfriend's been resuscitated." I was like, "I've got to go, George, I'm so sorry." Nice to have you back. And George made it to the news that night. He made it to NBN Channel 3 local news. It was so exciting. And I always remember the way the reporter finished her piece to camera. She said, "So there we have local miracle George Peach, died and come back to life, just like Jesus Christ, Lazarus, or Kiefer Sutherland in the film Flatliners." And George got taken away in an ambulance. And after a long stay in hospital, eventually, George Peach came back to school. Now, I hadn't seen him since the accident, and he looked different. I mean, he'd been on a liquids diet because of all the damage to his face. And he was skinny now. I mean, he'd lost all this weight. And because of the damage to his pelvis, he now had to walk with a walking cane. And when he walked in on that first morning, everybody was just looking at him like, "That's the kid who died and came back to life. What does he know?" And nobody picked on George Peach for an entire morning. And then by about lunchtime, you could tell that Simon Drake had just had a gutful of this amnesty on George Peach. So he decided to test the waters. And Simon Drake screams out across the playground to George Peach. He says, "Hey, spew balls!" And Simon Drake laughed. And he said, "Yeah, that's what I thought, faggot." And that was when George Peach, very slowly and painfully, got to his feet. And he limped across the playground towards Simon Drake. And his cane, it clicked against the concrete, and it was though with each click, more people stopped talking, more people turned around, more people were watching, until it felt like the entire school was holding its breath. And George Peach limped right up to Simon Drake, and he leaned in, and he said to him, "I know what happens to you." Now, for 5 days, Simon Drake did not touch his skateboard. He walked everywhere. But on the 5th day, you could tell he wasn't going to let George Peach get inside his head. So he went out riding, and with great fear and trepidation, he approached a jump, and he didn't approach it fast enough. He came off mid-flight, landed, shattered his right ankle. And when George Peach heard the news, he limped up to him and he said in front of the entire school, "That was a warning." And after the Simon Drake prediction, George Peach started making all these other predictions, and he was getting stuff right. I mean, he predicted Tulio Agosto would crash his V8 Mustang out at Murdering Gully. It happened. He predicted that the police would find and destroy Andrew Davies' marijuana plants. It happened. He predicted that Donna Santini's dad's pizzeria would go bankrupt. It happened. He even had a session with Miss Perkins. And I don't know what he said to her, but after their little chat, she stopped drinking. Gin. Suddenly everything was changing for George Peach. I mean, he wasn't just popular. He was the most revered kid in school, and he was my friend. And it didn't have to be a secret anymore. You know, I remember this one afternoon, I was on the bus and I sat down next to George Peach so everybody could see, you know. And George Peach had this yellow flyer. And I said to him, "What's that?" And he said, "It's an invitation to a party." I was like, "Oh my God, George, this is going to be a proper wild teenage party, like in film and television." I said, we've got to go to this. Whose party is it? And he said, I don't know, some kid in year 11. I was like, oh my, some kid in year 11? I mean, when you're in junior school, that is as exciting as being invited onto a party on Snoop Dogg's yacht. I mean, obviously that's exciting if you're a boy. If you're a girl, that is a long night. That's work. It's work. Suddenly, George Peach's demeanour changed. And he said to me, Sarah, you can't go to this party. And I said, why not? And he said, because I know what happens to you. He said, if you go to this party, you're going to do something and everyone's going to round in on you and they're going to bully you. It's going to be bad. I said, come on, George, I'll be careful. And he said, it's not like that. You can't stop this from happening. And I said, okay, I won't go. For days, I was disappointed, and I couldn't figure out why. Like, since when did I care about parties? I was invisible. I was off the radar. That's how I liked things. And I was hiding out in the library one lunchtime. I couldn't believe it. There was the book that George had shown me on the bus all those months back before he died, Magic Illusions and the Power of Suggestion. I took the book off the shelf and I looked at the borrower's card. Only one person had ever borrowed this book. There was his name in his neat handwriting, George Peach. And I looked at his name and I realised it wasn't the party I'd been excited about. It wasn't the party that I was disappointed about. It was George Peach. And I ran my finger along his name and I whispered, I love you, George Peach. I was a very intense teenager, ladies and gentlemen. And I looked through that book and there was every single trick that he had done for me on the bus. There was the bending of the coins. There was the card tricks. He'd even highlighted the phrase, now close your eyes and count to 3. And then I got to chapter 7. Chapter 7, cold reading. And it said, by utilising the techniques outlined in this chapter, you too will be able to convince even the biggest skeptic that you are psychic. It was a trick. Of course it was a trick. George Peach had been lying to everybody. George Peach had lied to me. And I slammed the book shut and I said, you son of a bitch. I mean, I was angry, but I was still in a library. And I stomped over to George Peach's house that afternoon. I bashed on his door and he answered the door. And I said, I know what you're doing, George Peach. I know exactly what you're doing. This is just a lie. And he said, it is not a lie. He said, I have a gift. I said, George, I've borrowed the book. I know how you do all of it. I mean, Simon Drake, all you did was predict that a skateboarder was going to fall off his skateboard. And he said, all right. How'd I get it right about Tullio Agosto's car crash? I was like, Tullio Agosto drives a V8 Mustang. I mean, it speeds when it's parked. I said, just tell me, how did you know the police were going to find and destroy Andrew Davies' marijuana plants? And he said, because I called them. I said, how did you know Donna Santini's dad's pizzeria would go bankrupt? And he said, because the only people who ever ate there were high on Andrew Davies' marijuana. He said, it's just suggestion and probability. And phone calls to the police. I said, George, I know why you lied to everyone else, but why did you lie to me? I thought we were friends. And he said, you wouldn't talk to me in public. You didn't visit me in hospital. I waited for you. You were ashamed of me. So guess what? I don't want you to come to this party with me because now I'm ashamed of you. And I knew that George Peach didn't love me. He didn't even like me. He hated me. So I did what any spurned teenager does in a situation like that to maintain dignity. I hated him right back. I said, all right, George Peach, let's see how popular you are when everybody finds out you're a liar. And he said, oh, come on, who's going to believe you? I said, he ain't going to believe you. And I went to school the next day. I couldn't wait to tell everybody that George Peach was a liar. And as I looked around the school, I couldn't get over how the school had changed, how the landscape had transformed because of George Peach's lie. And George didn't turn up to school that day. You know, I looked all over for him. Eventually I found him at the end of the day. He was sitting down on the beach. And I approached him and I said, George, I treated you like shit. All this time I thought that Simon Drake was the biggest bully in school, but it was me, because I pretended to be your friend. And if I'd just spoken to you on that day in October, none of this would have happened. And George said, was that an apology? I said, yes, I'm sorry. And I'm not going to tell anyone that you're not psychic. And he said, I knew you were going to say that. And we laughed at his dumb joke. And would you believe at that moment, the sun, it burst through the clouds. There was light everywhere. And he said, what are you doing this weekend? And I said, nothing, way too quickly. And he said, do you want to come to this party with me? And I said, yes, I do. And he stood up, and as we walked off, our hands touched. And we just held hands. And as we were walking off down the beach, I said to George, hey, George, do you want to see a magic trick? And he said, sure. I said, George, I can bring dead people back to life. He said, you can. I said, I can, George. With a story, you can fix anything. I mean, your life doesn't have to end just because no one could resuscitate you when you drowned in October of 1990. I'll fix all of that. He said, how? I said, it's a story, George. I get to play God. I'll change everything. I'll change it so somebody knew CPR. And you'll get brought back to life on that beach. And you can get back at all those kids who bullied you. And we could become friends. And you could forgive me. And George said, can I have a girlfriend at the end? And I said, sure. And he said, oh, shit, is it going to be you? I said, George, the only other woman in the story is Miss Perkins. I said, George, I've sat on this beach and I've made up 1,000 stories. And in every single one of them, you get to live. Do you want me to make one up for you now? Do you like that? He said, yeah. I said, all right, George Peach. Close your eyes and count to 3. I'm going to tell you a story about a day in October when I saw a miracle happen to you, George Peach.
Sarah Kendall's Australian trilogy was written and performed by Sarah Kendall. It was produced by Carl Cooper. It was a BBC Studios production.